We wanted to take a moment to note the passing of Don Cornelius, the creator of Soul Train. He died today in Los Angeles at 75, an apparent suicide.
There's one story about Soul Train that almost never made it into the history books. It wasn't a bad dance move or forgotten lyric. It was a real, physical confrontation that broke out on a set built entirely around smiling faces and perfect rhythm. For decades, the people who ran the show did everything they could to keep it quiet. But pieces of it eventually leaked out. And once they did, fans finally understood that the most beloved dance show in television history was hiding a far messier truth behind its glossy Afro-sheen shine. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on that moment, the man at the center of it, and the slow unraveling of a cultural empire that started with nothing more than a local DJ and a good idea. Before we get to the scene itself, it helps to understand exactly what Soul Train meant to the people who watched it, because the incident only makes sense once you understand how much was riding on the show's image staying spotless. In the mid-1960s, Chicago television station WCIU was airing small, low-budget dance programs aimed at teenagers. One of them featured a mostly black cast of dancers, and it quietly became one of the station's most popular offerings. A local radio personality named Don Cornelius took notice. Cornelius had already been running live dance events at Chicago high schools, calling them the Soul Train, a nod to the way he would travel by train from neighborhood to neighborhood, bringing music and energy with him wherever he went. Cornelius believed something simple but radical for the era. Black music, black fashion, and black culture deserved their own stage on national television, presented on their own terms rather than filtered through someone else's lens. In August of 1970, that belief became a television program. It launched as a local black and white broadcast on WCIU, a modest afternoon show with a small budget and even smaller expectations. But it had something that couldn't be manufactured: genuine energy. Within a year, Cornelius had secured sponsorship from a hair care company and pushed the show into national syndication, first landing in a handful of major cities before expanding to dozens more within a single season. What made the show different wasn't just the music, although the guest list eventually included nearly every major name in soul, R&B, funk, and later hip-hop. What made it different was who got to be on camera. The dancers weren't professionals. They were teenagers and young adults pulled from Los Angeles neighborhoods, rec centers, and community events, given a chance to show off moves they had invented themselves. For an entire generation of viewers, watching people who looked like them dancing with total freedom on national television was nothing short of revolutionary. Don Cornelius became the face of that revolution. His deep voice, his calm delivery, and his now famous sign-off, love, peace, and soul, turned him into one of the most recognizable figures in black entertainment. He was also, notably, one of the first black men in America to own and produce a nationally syndicated television program, a fact that gave him enormous creative control, but also placed enormous pressure on him to protect the show's reputation at all costs. And that instinct to protect the brand is exactly what led to the cover-up. By the mid-1970s, Soul Train had become appointment viewing across the country, and its dancers had become minor celebrities in their own right. One of them was a young performer named Rosie Perez, who would later go on to a successful career as a film actress. Perez was one of Cornelius's favorite dancers for a stretch of time, and according to later interviews she gave, Cornelius had taken a personal interest in shaping her career, reportedly encouraging her to join a musical group he was assembling behind the scenes. Perez said no. What happened next became one of the most tightly guarded stories in the show's history. According to her own account, given years later, once she had the standing to speak freely about her time on the show, a disagreement between the two escalated well past a simple creative dispute. Perez has described the confrontation as becoming physical, and in her retelling, the only thing within reach in that moment was the meal dancers were typically given as their only form of compensation, a 2-piece box of fried chicken. She says she picked it up and threw it, striking Cornelius. She has since said she was mortified by the entire episode. Whether or not cameras were rolling when tempers boiled over, nothing from that day was ever broadcast, and for years the incident lived only as rumor among people who had worked on set. It simply didn't fit the image Soul Train had spent years building. The show ran on the idea of effortless cool, of a host who never broke a sweat and dancers who radiated pure joy. A shouting match, let alone a physical altercation between the show's owner and one of its stars, was a kind of story that could unravel that image overnight if it ever reached the public before the show's producers were ready for it. If they ever were. But the chicken wing incident wasn't really about chicken, and it wasn't really about one disagreement. It was a symptom of something larger that had been building under the surface of the show for years, a widening gap between the polished world audiences saw on Saturday mornings and the working conditions many dancers say they actually experienced. Once you start pulling on that thread, a much bigger and more uncomfortable picture starts to emerge. For years, Soul Train, dancers were not treated as paid employees in any traditional sense. Multiple dancers who appeared on the show in its earlier decades have said they received no wages at all for their appearances. Instead, they were offered exposure, the chance to be seen on national television, and occasionally a meal provided on set, the very same fried chicken dinners that would later become a symbol of the dispute with Perez. That arrangement might have been more defensible if the show hadn't been generating real money from advertisers eager to reach a national black audience for the first time. Companies that had never before targeted black consumers directly began buying airtime specifically because of Soul Train's reach, which means the show was a legitimate commercial success even in its early years. Yet many of the young performers whose innovation and style were arguably the show's biggest draw walked away with nothing but a television credit and a meal. Some of those dancers have said in later interviews that the show's popularity was, in their words, built on their sweat, without much coming back to them in return. Dancers who originated moves that spread through American pop culture, including styles that would later be adapted and popularized under different names, reportedly received no credit and no compensation for their contributions. On top of the financial imbalance, several dancers have described an environment where they were regularly pitted against one another, competing for camera time, better positions near the stage, and a chance of being noticed by a producer or performer who might help launch a career elsewhere. Then there were the more serious allegations. Journalists who investigated the show's history years later reported claims that Cornelius, despite being married at the time, pursued personal relationships with some of the young women who danced on the show. These reports added an uncomfortable layer to an already complicated picture, a show that presented itself publicly as a wholesome celebration of community and culture, while privately grappling with power imbalances between an older, famous, financially dominant owner and the teenagers and young adults who depended on him for their one shot at visibility. None of this fit the brand. And Cornelius, ever the businessman, understood exactly how fragile that brand could be if the wrong story got out at the wrong time. Part of what makes the chicken wing incident and the broader pattern around it so revealing is how it lines up with everything we know about how tightly Cornelius controlled every other aspect of the show. He was notoriously strict about the show's presentation. Performers who didn't lip-sync convincingly enough were made to redo their segments until they got it right. Cornelius set clear limits on how suggestive dance moves could be, and he pushed back against dance styles he considered too far outside the bounds of what he wanted Soul Train to represent. This wasn't simply about taste. Cornelius owned the show outright, a rare and hard-won position for a black entrepreneur in the television industry at that time, and he treated that ownership as something to be defended fiercely. He negotiated directly with local stations to get the show on air city by city. He fought off at least one direct attempt by a competitor to create a copycat program, accusing the rival network of trying to squeeze the only black-owned show off national television, a battle that Cornelius ultimately won when the copycat show was canceled after a handful of episodes. A man who fought that hard to protect his ownership and his show's image was not going to let a physical altercation with one of his dancers or persistent complaints about unpaid labor become public knowledge if he could help it. For years, he largely succeeded. Stories stayed contained to whispers among people who worked on the show, surfacing publicly only decades later once dancers and crew members felt free to speak on the record, often only after Cornelius's death removed any professional risk in doing so. The tension behind the scenes didn't cause the show's cancellation on its own, but became part of a larger unraveling that played out over the show's final years. By the time Soul Train reached its mid-2000s seasons, ratings had fallen well below where they once stood. Stations that once aired the show during prime Saturday afternoon slots had pushed it into late-night time periods on smaller, independent channels, making it harder for even loyal fans to find. New episodes stopped being produced after the 2005 to 2006 season, replaced instead by rebroadcast of classic footage under a new banner, celebrating the show's history rather than continuing it. Around the same time, the syndication company responsible for distributing the show announced it was shutting down entirely, leaving Soul Train without a reliable path onto television screens. Cornelius scrambled to find a new distribution partner, but by then the cultural moment that had made the show essential viewing had shifted. Hip-hop had become the dominant sound in black music, and Cornelius, by his own admission, never fully connected with the genre. He once told a prominent rap artist directly that the music simply wasn't something he understood, and he later said some of the more politically charged hip-hop acts of the era genuinely unsettled him. Even as he continued booking rap performers to keep the show relevant, it was clear his heart remained with the soul and R&B era that had built his career. Copyright enforcement added another obstacle. Cornelius was famously protective of the show's archive, actively working to get bootleg clips pulled from early video-sharing platforms and blocking unauthorized sales of old episodes on VHS and DVD. That protectiveness may have preserved the value of the archive, but also meant an entire generation of younger viewers, who were used to finding anything they wanted to watch online, simply couldn't access Soul Train content easily. The show that had once defined Saturday mornings for millions of families became, for younger audiences, something they had heard about more than something they had actually seen. By 1993, Cornelius had already stepped back from hosting duties, handing the microphone to a rotating cast of replacement hosts over the following years. None of them stayed long enough to redefine the show in the public imagination the way Cornelius had. Without his steady, unmistakable voice guiding each episode, longtime viewers have said the show lost a sense of identity that had made it feel like a weekly ritual rather than just another program filling a time slot. Soul Train officially aired its final new episode after 35 seasons in 2006, closing the book on one of the longest continuously running programs in American television history. Cornelius sold the rights to the brand in 2008, and ownership changed hands more than once in the years that followed, eventually landing with a media company backed in part by a well-known former basketball star, before ultimately being absorbed by a larger media conglomerate. Don Cornelius did not get to see how the brand's legacy would continue to evolve. In 2012, he died by suicide, a shock to nearly everyone who knew him. Longtime associates and business partners said he had seemed fine just days before, giving no visible sign of the struggles he was privately experiencing. Fans around the country responded by dressing in 1970s-inspired outfits and dancing in tribute, a spontaneous, nationwide send-off for a man whose signature line, wishing viewers love, peace, and soul, had become a permanent part of American pop culture memory. In the years since his death, some of the uncomfortable stories that had once stayed carefully hidden have finally made their way into the open. Dancers have spoken candidly in interviews and in a Broadway-bound stage production based on the show's history about the lack of pay, the intense competition for camera time, and the uneven power dynamics that shaped their experience behind the scenes. None of it erases what Soul Train meant to millions of people who tuned in every week, but it does complicate the story in a way that feels necessary. The show that gave black music, fashion, and culture a national stage for the first time was, at the same time, built partly on unpaid labor and unresolved tension that its own producers worked hard to keep out of view. That's the real reason the infamous chicken wing confrontation stayed buried for so long. It wasn't just an embarrassing outburst between two people who disagreed. It was a crack in the carefully maintained image of a show that needed to look effortless, joyful, and controlled at all times in order to survive in an industry that offered black-owned programming very little room for error. Once that crack became visible, it opened the door to a much fuller, messier, and ultimately more honest picture of what it actually took to build one of the most influential shows in television history. So the next time you watch an old Soul Train clip and see the dancers gliding effortlessly down that iconic line, know that behind the smooth choreography and the smoother host, there was a very human story of ambition, control, and conflict that the people running the show fought hard to keep off the air. Some secrets stayed buried by accident. This one stayed buried on purpose, for as long as the people who lived it were willing to let it. What do you think? Should more of these behind-the-scenes stories from classic television have come out while the people involved were still around to answer for them? Or is it better that some of these stories waited until now? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget